Some men mistake silence for submission. Magnus. Kaiser was about to learn the difference between a quiet woman and a sleeping lioness. The crystal chandelier cast diamonds of light across the marble floor of their penthouse, each sparkle reflecting the shattered fragments of what Magnus Kaiser believed was his perfect world. Christmas Eve had always been their night, their sanctuary from the chaos of his tech empire, their moment of intimacy away from board meetings and quarterly reports. But tonight, the silence between them felt different, heavier, pregnant with the weight of unspoken truths. Aziza sat in her usual chair by the fireplace, her dark skin glowing in the amber light, fingers delicately tracing the rim of her wineglass. She wore the simple black dress he'd bought her last Christmas, the one he'd chosen because it made her look approachable for his business partners' wives. How fitting that she would wear it tonight, on the night he planned to discard her like an unwanted accessory. "For years," Magnus began, his voice carrying the cold precision that made board members tremble. "4 years I've carried you through this marriage. 4 years of pretending you belong in my world." He stood from his leather chair, adjusting his Armani cufflinks with the casual arrogance of a man who'd never been truly challenged. "But honestly, Aziza, look at yourself. Look at what you are." She didn't flinch, didn't move. Her composure was unsettling in its completeness, like the calm before a hurricane that promises to reshape coastlines. "You sit in my penthouse, wear clothes I bought, attend parties where you smile politely, while real power brokers shape the world. You're a beautiful ornament, I'll give you that. But ornaments eventually go out of style." Magnus pulled the manila envelope from his jacket pocket, the divorce papers he'd had prepared 3 months ago. "I need a partner who can match my ambition, not a housewife who reads books and tends gardens." The papers landed on the coffee table between them with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the vast space. Aziza's eyes moved to the envelope, then back to his face, still saying nothing. Her silence was starting to unnerve him, but he pressed forward with the speech he'd rehearsed. "I'm being generous. The prenup we signed protects my assets, but I'll give you the Connecticut house and enough money to live comfortably. You can find someone more suitable to your station. Maybe a teacher or a social worker. Someone ordinary, like you." The word ordinary hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Aziza set down her wineglass with the careful precision of someone performing a ritual. When she finally spoke, her voice was silk wrapped around steel. "Ordinary." She tasted the word as if sampling wine that had turned to vinegar. "Is that what you see when you look at me, Magnus?" "It's what everyone sees." He was gaining confidence now, feeding off what he mistook for her vulnerability. "You're a beautiful black woman from a middle-class family who got lucky enough to marry up. But luck runs out, sweetheart. And mine has definitely run out on this marriage." Aziza rose from her chair with fluid grace, moving to the window that overlooked Manhattan's glittering skyline. The city spread beneath them like a circuit board of power and possibility, each light representing dreams and ambitions and the endless hunger for more. How many nights had she stood at this window, watching the empire she secretly owned, while pretending to be impressed by his small corner of it? "Do you see that building?" She pointed to a gleaming tower 12 blocks away. "The one with the Meridian Global logo?" "Of course. They're one of my biggest investors." Magnus joined her at the window, pleased to be discussing business even during their divorce conversation. "Meridian controls about 60% of my funding." "Why? And that one?" She indicated another skyscraper, this one bearing the distinctive blue glass of Cosmos Industries. "They handle your overseas manufacturing, don't they?" "Aziza, what does this have to do with anything?" Impatience crept into his voice. "We're getting divorced. You don't need to pretend to understand my business anymore." She turned from the window, and for a moment something flickered in her eyes that made him step back. It was there and gone so quickly, he wondered if he'd imagined it, but it looked almost like pity. "Magnus, in 4 years of marriage, did you ever think to ask about my maiden name?" The question seemed to come from nowhere. What, Aziza? I don't know. Johnson, Williams. Does it matter? You're about to be nobody's wife. Valentina. The name dropped from her lips like a stone into still water, sending ripples through his consciousness. Aziza Valentina. Magnus blinked. The name tickled something in his memory, but he couldn't place it. So, she walked to the mahogany desk in the corner of the room, his desk where he conducted the business that he believed made him master of this domain. From the bottom drawer, she withdrew a single manila folder, far thinner than the divorce papers, but somehow commanding much more attention. I've been waiting 4 years for you to ask. She returned to stand before him, the folder held loosely in her hands. 4 years of watching you build your little empire. 4 years of listening to you lecture me about business and power and what it means to be successful. 4 years of loving a man who never once wondered who I really was. Something cold began to creep up Magnus's spine. Aziza, what are you talking about? Do you remember our wedding day? You introduced me to your business partners as my beautiful bride, but you never told them my last name. Even then, you were erasing my identity. She opened the folder, revealing documents that looked far more official and far more expensive than anything in his office. You were so eager to have a gorgeous black woman on your arm, so proud of how progressive you looked, that you never thought to investigate the woman you were marrying. I know who you are. You're Aziza Johnson from Detroit, daughter of a postal worker and a nurse, graduate of Michigan State with a degree in literature. I had you investigated before I proposed. Her laugh was soft and terrible. Oh, Magnus, you investigated a fiction. She handed him the first document. It was a birth certificate, official and embossed, showing Aziza Valentina born in Geneva, Switzerland, to Eduardo Valentina and Anastasia Petrov Valentina. The second document was a passport, diplomatic status. The third was a financial statement from Credit Suisse that made his hands shake as he read the numbers. Valentina Global Holdings, she said quietly, as he stared at papers that were rearranging his understanding of reality. Perhaps you've heard of us. We're fairly small, only about 900 billion in assets under management. The folder slipped from Magnus's numb fingers, documents scattering across the floor like the pieces of his shattered worldview. Valentina Global Holdings. He knew that name. Every serious businessman knew that name. They were the shadow empire, the puppet masters who pulled strings from behind curtains of Swiss banking laws and shell corporations. They owned pieces of everything: tech companies, oil fields, pharmaceutical patents, media conglomerates, defense contractors. If you had serious money anywhere in the world, some portion of it eventually flowed through Valentina channels. No. His voice came out as a croak. No, that's impossible. Eduardo Valentina he's... Magnus's mind raced through everything he'd ever read about the mysterious billionaire. He's the most powerful private citizen on Earth. He doesn't have a daughter. No family, no heirs. It's all run by a board of trustees. Wrong again. Aziza's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. He has one heir, one daughter, one person who will inherit the largest private fortune in human history. She gestured around their penthouse with its million-dollar view and its imported marble. One woman who has been playing housewife in your little dollhouse while owning the companies that actually own your companies. Magnus sank into his chair, the divorce papers forgotten on the table. This is impossible. You're making this up. You can't be Meridian Global? That's ours. Cosmos Industries also ours. The bank that holds your company's debt? The government contracts that fund your research? The venture capital firm that gave you your first real investment? With each revelation, Aziza's voice grew stronger, more commanding. All ours, Magnus. Every step of your climb to what you thought was the top has been on a ladder we built. The room seemed to be spinning. 4 years of marriage to the most powerful woman on earth, and he'd spent every day condescending to her about business. 4 years of explaining his small accomplishments to someone who could buy and sell his entire industry without checking her account balance. Why? The word escaped him like a prayer. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I loved you." The simple statement hit him harder than all the financial documents combined. "I met you at that charity auction, and I saw a brilliant man building something real. You were passionate and driven, and you looked at me like I was the most beautiful woman in the room. Not because of my father's money or my family's influence, but because of me." Tears glittered in her eyes, and for a moment she looked like the woman he'd fallen in love with, vulnerable, achingly beautiful, gloriously human. "I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd found someone who could love Aziza instead of loving what Aziza could do for them. So I created a fiction. I became the woman you wanted, supportive, impressed by your success, content to live in your shadow." The tears didn't fall. They hung in her eyes like accusations. "I even had my father's people create the entire Johnson family background, a whole fake identity, so I could be ordinary enough for you to love." Magnus felt like he was drowning in the implications. "Your father?" "Eduardo Valentina knows about me. He's known about you from our first date. He's been watching you build your company with his money, while you disparage his daughter as worthless." Now her voice carried the cold weight of absolute power. "He's been very patient, Magnus. We both have, waiting to see if you would grow into a man worthy of the woman you married. And now?" Aziza looked at the divorce papers on the table, then back at him. "Now you've shown us exactly who you are. A man who throws away the most precious thing he's ever been given because he's too arrogant to recognize its value." She moved toward the door, leaving the scattered documents on the floor like evidence at a crime scene. "The divorce papers are unnecessary. I'll have my lawyers handle everything. You can keep the penthouse for now. I'll buy the building tomorrow and decide later whether to evict you." Magnus scrambled to his feet. "Aziza, wait. I didn't know. If you had known, you would have married me for my money instead of despite it." She paused at the door, her hand on the crystal handle. "Either way, you never would have married me for me." The door closed behind her with the soft finality of a coffin lid, leaving Magnus alone with the ruins of everything he thought he knew about his life. On the floor around his feet lay the scattered proof that the woman he had just divorced was not just out of his league. She was the league. The quiet, bookish wife he'd discarded as ordinary was the most extraordinarily powerful person he had ever met. "You wanted to divorce a housewife." Her voice seemed to echo in the sudden silence of the empty penthouse. "But you just declared war on an empress." Chapter 2: The Awakening. They say revenge is a dish best served cold. Aziza Valentina preferred hers, served with the complete annihilation of everything. Her enemy held dear the marble floors of Valentina Global's. Manhattan headquarters had witnessed the footsteps of presidents and prime ministers, oil sheiks and tech moguls, the architects of nations and the destroyers of economies. But they had never echoed with quite the same resonance as they did this morning. As Aziza Valentina walked through the lobby in her true element for the first time in 4 years. Gone was the demure housewife wardrobe Magnus had chosen for her. Today she wore power like haute couture, a midnight blue Chanel suit that cost more than most people's cars, Louboutin heels that clicked against marble with the rhythm of an executioner's drum, and jewelry that caught the light like captured stars. But it was her expression that truly transformed her. The mask of submissive contentment had been replaced by the cold beauty of absolute authority. Ms. Valentina, her executive assistant Laurent, greeted her as she stepped into the private elevator that would take her to the 92nd floor. "Your father is waiting in the war room. The termination protocols are prepared and ready for your authorization." The war room. How fitting that Magnus's destruction would be orchestrated from the very place where global markets were manipulated like chess pieces. Aziza allowed herself a smile as thin and sharp as a blade. For 4 years, she had played the role of loving wife while Magnus built his empire. Now it was time for him to learn what an empire looked like when it fell. Eduardo Valentina stood with his back to the door when she entered, his silver hair perfectly groomed despite the early hour. At 73, he remained as formidable as the day he'd first walked out of war-torn Eastern Europe, with nothing but ambition and a talent for seeing 3 moves ahead of everyone else. The wall before him displayed a digital map of the world, with red dots marking Valentina holdings and blue dots showing their targets. There were far more red dots than blue ones. "Minha filha," he said without turning around. "I trust your husband enjoyed his Christmas present?" "Ex-husband," Aziza corrected, moving to stand beside the man who had taught her that power was not about what you owned, but about what you controlled. "And yes, I believe Magnus found our revelation quite illuminating." Eduardo's laugh was soft and dangerous. "For years I have watched this boy play with companies I could buy with my pocket change. For years I have listened to reports of him explaining business to my daughter as if she were a child. Did you know he once told his board of directors that you were charmingly naive about financial matters? I heard the recording." Aziza's voice carried no emotion, but her father knew her well enough to recognize the fury burning beneath the surface. "Shall we begin?" "The termination orders are prepared. 27 companies across 6 continents will cease doing business with Kaiser Technologies within the hour. His government contracts will be under review by lunch. His bank will call his loans by close of business." Eduardo finally turned to face his daughter, and his eyes gleamed with predatory satisfaction. "By tomorrow, Magnus Kaiser will wake up to discover that his empire was always built on sand." Aziza moved to the conference table, where thick folders lay arranged like tarot cards, predicting a very specific future. Each folder represented a piece of Magnus's world that was about to crumble. Supplier contracts, investor agreements, partnership deals, research grants, all of them connected by invisible threads to the Valentina web. "What about his patents?" she asked, opening a folder labeled Intellectual Property Assets. "His 3 most valuable patents were developed using research funded by our shell companies. Perfectly legal to reclaim them." Eduardo's smile was terrifying in its gentleness. "His revolutionary battery technology. The research was purchased from a team we've been funding for 8 years. His breakthrough in quantum processing? That came from a lab we own in Singapore." Each revelation was another nail in the coffin of Magnus's perceived genius. For 4 years, he had strutted around their penthouse talking about his innovations and his business acumen, never realizing that his greatest successes had been gifts from the woman he was now divorcing. And his personal finances. Leverage. Eduardo opened another folder, this one containing financial documents that would make an accountant weep. His penthouse? Mortgaged through one of our banks. His cars, his art collection, his share portfolio, all purchased with credit that we ultimately control. One phone call, and Mr. Kaiser will discover that being rich and being wealthy are very different things. Aziza studied the documents with the same attention she'd once given to Magnus's bedtime stories about his business conquests. Every asset, every investment, every source of pride in her ex-husband's life could be traced back to Valentina money. He had been living inside their web for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to truly own something. "There is one more thing," Eduardo said quietly. "Something I have been saving for the right moment." He handed her a file marked "Personal Eyes Only." Inside were photographs and documents that made Aziza's breath catch in her throat. Magnus at business dinners with other women. Magnus in hotel rooms that weren't their bedroom. Magnus living a double life while she played the devoted wife at home. "How long have you known?" she asked, her voice steady despite the images burning themselves into her memory. 18 months. I'd hoped he would end it on his own, show some small measure of honor. Instead, he became more careless. Eduardo's voice carried the weight of a father's protective fury. "Did you know," he told his board, "that marriage to you was good for his image in diversity markets?" The words hit her like physical blows. diversity markets, as if her love had been a calculated business decision designed to make him appear more progressive to investors and clients. As if 4 years of her life had been nothing more than a public relations strategy. "Begin the termination sequence," she said quietly. Eduardo nodded and pressed a button on the conference table. Across the room, banks of monitors came to life, showing markets and companies and the digital nervous system of the global economy. In boardrooms around the world, phones were beginning to ring. Contracts were being voided. Relationships that had taken years to build were being severed with surgical precision. It will take 72 hours for the full impact to be felt, Eduardo explained as they watched Magnus's world begin to unravel in real time. By Monday morning, Kaiser Technologies will be a cautionary tale told in business schools. Aziza watched the monitors with the detached fascination of a scientist observing an experiment. Each cancelled contract was another thread cut from the web that had supported Magnus's illusions. Each withdrawn investment was another pillar removed from the temple of his arrogance. "There's something else," she said after a long moment. "I want to go public." Eduardo raised an eyebrow. For 40 years, the Valentina family had operated from the shadows, pulling strings while remaining invisible to all but the most informed observers. The suggestion that his daughter step into the spotlight was unexpected. Public how? Interviews, magazine covers, speaking engagements. "I want the world to know exactly who Aziza Valentina is." She turned from the monitors to face her father directly. "For 4 years, I've been content to be invisible. But Magnus made one crucial mistake. He made this personal. And what do you hope to accomplish? I want him to turn on the news and see the woman he called ordinary, gracing the cover of Forbes. I want him to read about the empire he never knew existed. I want every person who ever dismissed me as Magnus Kaiser's pretty wife to understand exactly what they were looking at." Her smile was beautiful and terrible. "I want him to know that while he was cheating on me with secretaries and socialites, he was actually cheating on the most powerful woman in the world." Eduardo considered this for a long moment. The Valentina family had built their empire on discretion and shadow play, but perhaps it was time for the shadows to step into the light. "Very well. I'll have our media relations team prepare a campaign. Fortune, Forbes, Vanity Fair, Time will give them the exclusive of the century." He paused, studying his daughter's face. "And what of Magnus himself? What about him?" "He will try to contact you. Try to apologize. Try to win you back once he realizes what he's lost." Aziza's laugh was soft and merciless. "Let him try. I'm curious to see what a man sounds like when he's begging for forgiveness from someone he spent 4 years treating like a beautiful idiot." The monitors around them continued, their digital dance of destruction as markets opened in Tokyo and Hong Kong. In a few hours, Magnus would wake up in their penthouse, soon to be just his penthouse, and begin receiving the phone calls that would teach him the difference between being successful and being powerful. "There is one last detail," Eduardo said, handing her a final document. "The building where his offices are located. We purchased it this morning." Aziza looked at the purchase agreement, noting that the price paid was roughly equivalent to what Magnus spent on wine in a typical year. "His lease? Expires at the end of the week. The new landlord has decided not to renew." As she signed her name to the document, Aziza reflected on the beautiful symmetry of it all. Magnus had thrown her away like garbage on Christmas Eve. By New Year's Day, he would understand exactly what garbage felt like when it was left on the curb for collection. "Sir, your wife, Miss Valentina is here to see you." Magnus's former secretary announced over the phone that would stop working in approximately 6 hours. Aziza smiled, imagining his confusion as he realized that for 4 years he had never even learned her real name. Chapter 3. The Fall. Pride goes before destruction, But Aziza Valentina was about to prove that humiliation comes after. Slowly, deliberately, and without mercy. The studio apartment in Queens was a universe away from the Manhattan penthouse Magnus had called home for 8 years. 42 floors down from where he used to survey his empire, he now stared through a window that offered a view of a brick wall and a dumpster that hadn't been emptied in 3 weeks. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd gone from looking down on the world to staring at literal garbage. 3 months had passed since Christmas Eve. 3 months since his world had been systematically dismantled by the woman he'd thrown away like yesterday's newspaper. The speed of his fall had been breathtaking in its completeness. One day, he'd been Magnus Kaiser, tech visionary and master of his domain. The next, he was Magnus Kaiser, cautionary tale. The television droned in the background, a constant companion in his new reality of unemployment and humiliation. He'd grown accustomed to seeing his name in the news, though never in the context he'd once craved. Kaiser Technologies files for bankruptcy. Former tech CEO under investigation for securities fraud. The rise and fall of Silicon Valley's biggest failure. But today's news was different. Today, the television was showing him something that made his blood freeze in his veins. In an exclusive interview with Forbes, Aziza Valentina, heir to the Valentina global fortune, speaks for the first time about her brief marriage to fallen tech entrepreneur Magnus Kaiser. The anchor's voice cut through Magnus's consciousness like a knife through butter. The interview reveals shocking details about one of the most powerful women in the world, living in disguise for 4 years. The screen filled with an image that stopped Magnus's heart. It was Aziza, but not the Aziza he remembered. This woman commanded the camera with a presence that radiated power from every pore. She wore a white Armani suit that probably cost more than his current monthly rent. Her hair swept back in a style that screamed executive authority. Her eyes cold and brilliant as Arctic stars. The Forbes headline read, "The Shadow Empress, How the World's Most Powerful Heiress Hid in Plain Sight." "Ms. Valentina," the interviewer began, "you've just been named as the sole heir to the Valentina global empire, worth an estimated $900 billion. Yet for 4 years, you lived as the wife of a tech entrepreneur, unknown to the public. Can you explain this extraordinary situation?" Aziza's smile was polite and devastating. "I fell in love with a man who I believed loved me for who I was, not what I represented. So I created an identity that would allow him to love me without the complications of my family's position. And how did that work out? It taught me that some men are incapable of loving a woman they don't believe they're superior to." Her voice carried no bitterness, which somehow made the words even more cutting. "My former husband spent our entire marriage explaining business to me, offering me career advice, and generally treating me like an attractive but dim accessory to his life." Magnus sank into his second-hand couch, watching the woman he'd condescended to for 4 years speak with the casual authority of someone accustomed to reshaping global markets before breakfast. Every word she spoke was another nail in the coffin of his already dead reputation. What was the breaking point? The interviewer pressed. "Christmas Eve. He served me with divorce papers, told me I was ordinary, that I needed to find someone more suitable to my station. He suggested a teacher or a social worker." Aziza's laugh was musical and merciless. It was ironic, really. He was divorcing me for being beneath him, while sitting in a penthouse that my family's money had purchased, wearing a watch that my companies had made possible, discussing the failure of a marriage to a woman whose net worth exceeded the GDP of most countries. The interviewer leaned forward. "And his reaction when you revealed the truth?" "Shock, disbelief, the usual response of a small man discovering he's been playing in a very large game." Aziza adjusted her jewelry, a simple diamond necklace that Magnus now realized probably cost more than his entire former company. But you have to understand, this wasn't about revenge. This was about education. Education. Teaching someone the difference between confidence and arrogance. between success and power, between having money and being wealth itself. Her eyes seemed to look directly through the camera, directly at him. Some lessons are expensive, others are priceless. The screen cut to stock footage of Kaiser Technologies' offices being cleared out, of Magnus himself looking haggard and defeated as he answered questions from federal investigators. The narrator's voice provided context that felt like salt in already gaping wounds. Kaiser Technologies collapsed within 72 hours of the divorce filing, leading to investigations that revealed the company's dependence on funding sources, ultimately controlled by Valentina Global Holdings. Magnus Kaiser, once valued at over $200 million, is now reportedly living in a studio apartment in Queens and facing multiple lawsuits from former investors. Magnus muted the television, but he couldn't silence the voice in his head that kept replaying Aziza's words. Some men are incapable of loving a woman they don't believe they're superior to. The truth of it cut him more deeply than any of the financial losses. He had loved her, hadn't he? But looking back now, with the clarity that only complete ruin could provide, he realized that what he'd called love was actually possession. What he'd called protection was actually control. His phone rang, the cheap prepaid cell that had replaced his previous flagship device. The number was blocked, but he answered anyway. These days, any call might be important. Magnus? The voice was familiar but unexpected. James Morrison, his former chief technology officer, one of the few people from his previous life who still acknowledged his existence. James, this is unexpected. I saw the interview. Jesus, Magnus. Aziza Valentina? You were married to Aziza Valentina, and you treated her like... James's voice trailed off, probably realizing that finishing the sentence wouldn't help anyone. Like what, James? Go ahead and say it. Like she was lucky to be with you. The words hung between them, heavy with accusation and pity. Do you have any idea what you threw away? Magnus looked around his studio apartment, taking in the cracked plaster walls and the radiator that clanged like a broken heart. I'm getting a pretty good idea. She could have destroyed you immediately. Christmas night. The moment you handed her those papers, she could have made one phone call and erased you from existence. Instead, she gave you 3 months to figure it out on your own. Figure what out? That you were nothing without her. That everything you thought you'd built was actually built for you. James's voice softened with something that might have been sympathy. Magnus, she loved you, really loved you, and you threw it away because you couldn't stand the possibility that your wife might be smarter than you. The line went dead, leaving Magnus alone with the silence of his new reality. He walked to the single window and looked out at the brick wall that had become his view of the world. Somewhere in Manhattan, Aziza was probably in meetings that would reshape entire industries. Somewhere above the clouds, she was flying to conferences where world leaders sought her counsel. Somewhere beyond his diminished reach, she was living the life of power and purpose that had always been hers. The life he'd been too blind and too arrogant to see. His reflection stared back at him from the window glass. Thin now, worn down by months of stress and sleepless nights, the man looking back at him bore little resemblance to the confident mogul who had once explained market dynamics to the most powerful woman in the world. The television screen still showed Aziza's face, frozen in that moment of beautiful, terrible authority. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, Valentina Global announces major expansion into emerging markets. Even with the sound muted, her power was palpable, radiating from the screen like heat from a forge. Magnus pressed his forehead against the cool glass and closed his eyes. For 4 years, he had shared a bed with an empress and treated her like a servant. For 4 years, he had been handed the greatest gift a man could receive and mistaken it for charity. For 4 years, he had been living inside a fairy tale and convinced himself he was the author of his own story. Stage 1 complete, he whispered to his reflection. remembering the words Aziz's assistant had spoken to the news cameras. A man who never learned to bow must first learn to crawl. Chapter 4. The Employment. The cruelest prisons have no bars. They have paychecks, performance reviews, and the daily reminder of what you used to be. The elevator in the Meridian Tower moved with the silent efficiency that only unlimited money could buy, carrying Magnus upward through floors of the building that had once housed some of his most important business meetings. Now he was returning not as a master of industry, but as a supplicant, riding to an interview for a position that would pay less in a year than he used to spend on wine in a month. 6 months had passed since his world collapsed. 6 months of rejection letters, closed doors, and the gradual understanding that being blacklisted by Valentina Global meant being blacklisted by everyone who mattered. His savings had evaporated like morning mist, consumed by legal fees and the basic costs of staying alive in a city that had no patience for fallen kings. The elevator opened on the 42nd floor, revealing a reception area that radiated understated power. Meridian Global Consulting occupied 3 floors of the building, and their client list read like a who's who of Fortune 500 companies. It was exactly the kind of place Magnus would have visited as an equal 6 months ago. Today, he was here to beg for employment. Mr. Kaiser? The receptionist's smile was professionally neutral, giving no indication that she recognized his name from the business pages. Miss Chen will see you now. Diana Chen's office was a study in controlled intimidation. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of Central Park. Original artwork hung on walls, painted in soothing earth tones, and the furniture whispered of Italian craftsmanship and unlimited budgets. Behind an oak desk that could have served as a landing pad for small aircraft sat a woman who couldn't have been older than 30, reviewing a file that Magnus assumed contained what remained of his professional reputation. "Please, sit." Her voice carried the confident authority of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. "I've reviewed your application for our junior analyst position." Junior analyst. The title felt like sandpaper against Magnus's ego. 6 months ago, junior analysts had competed for the privilege of presenting to him. Now he was competing to become one. "Ms. Chen, I want to be upfront about my situation. I understand that my recent difficulties might make me seem like a risky hire, but I believe my experience." "Mr. Kaiser." She held up one manicured finger, and he fell silent immediately. "Let me be equally upfront. You're here because someone very high up in our organization specifically requested that we interview you for this position. Left to my own judgment, your application would have been declined immediately." Magnus felt his cheeks burn with humiliation. "I see. Do you?" Diana's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Because I want to make sure we understand each other perfectly. You are not here because of your experience or your qualifications. You are here because Aziza Valentina wants you here. And what Aziza Valentina wants, Aziza Valentina gets." The name hit him like a physical blow. Of course, he should have realized that there was no coincidence in this opportunity, arising just as his other options dwindled to nothing. Aziza was still pulling strings, still orchestrating his life from whatever mountaintop she now occupied. "The position pays $35,000 annually," Diana continued, her tone suggesting that she was discussing the weather, rather than a salary that represented less than Magnus used to spend on a single business dinner. "You'll be working in our market research division, preparing reports and data analysis for our senior staff. The work is demanding, the hours are long, and the expectations are high." $35,000. Magnus's throat felt dry as desert sand. His former apartment's monthly mortgage payment had been more than that. But pride, he was learning, was a luxury he could no longer afford. "I understand," he managed. "Do you?" "Because I need to be crystal clear about something, Mr. Kaiser. Every person in this office knows who you are. They know about your marriage to Ms. Valentina. They know about your spectacular fall from grace. They know that you are here not because you deserve to be, but because you have nowhere else to go. Each word was delivered with surgical precision, designed to cut away whatever fragments of dignity Magnus might still possess. He sat in his off-the-rack suit, purchased at a discount store in Queens, and absorbed the verbal beating with the stoic acceptance of a man who had learned that resistance only made the humiliation worse. "Your supervisor will be Jennifer Washington," Diana continued, consulting her file. "She's 26 years old, graduated summa cum laude from Wharton, and has been with the company for 3 years. She will be your boss. Mr. Kaiser, the woman giving you assignments, reviewing your work, and determining whether you keep this job will be young enough to be your daughter and brilliant enough to run circles around anything you think you know about business." The message was clear. Magnus Kaiser, former captain of industry, would be taking orders from someone who had been in elementary school when he was building his first company. "I understand," Magnus repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Excellent!" Diana closed the file with a snap that sounded like a judge's gavel. "You start Monday at 8 a.m. sharp. Jennifer will meet you in the lobby to show you to your workspace." Magnus rose from his chair, extending his hand in what he hoped was a gesture of professional gratitude. Diana looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment before shaking it briefly, her grip firm and dismissive. "Oh, and Mr. Kaiser?" she called as he reached the door. "This building has security cameras everywhere. Ms. Valentina will know within minutes if you're late, if you're rude to staff, or if you display even the smallest hint of the arrogance that destroyed your previous career. I'd suggest you remember that." The elevator ride down felt like a descent into hell. Each floor that passed represented another step away from the man he used to be and toward whatever he was becoming. By the time he reached the lobby, Magnus understood that this job wasn't just employment, it was theater. A carefully orchestrated performance designed to teach him what it felt like to be powerless. Monday morning arrived with the inevitability of sunrise. Magnus stood in the lobby of Meridian Tower at 7:45, wearing his discount suit and carrying a briefcase that contained nothing but desperation and determination. The building's morning rush swirled around him. Men and women in expensive clothes carrying expensive accessories, all of them moving with the confident urgency of people who mattered in the world. "Mr. Kaiser?" The voice belonged to a young black woman whose beauty was matched only by the sharp intelligence in her eyes. She wore a navy blue dress that probably cost more than Magnus's monthly rent, and her smile held the same professional courtesy that barely concealed condescension. "I'm Jennifer Washington. Welcome to Meridian Global." The handshake was firm, her grip suggesting that she could probably bench press more than Magnus in his current undernourished state. As they walked toward the elevators, she maintained a steady stream of orientation information delivered in tones that made it clear she was addressing a subordinate. "Your cubicle is in the research pod on the 38th floor. You'll be sharing the space with 5 other junior analysts, most of whom are recent college graduates working their way up the corporate ladder." She pressed the elevator button with the casual efficiency of someone comfortable with authority. "Your primary responsibility will be data compilation for the senior partner's client presentations." The 38th floor was a maze of cubicles and conference rooms, humming with the productive energy of ambitious young professionals building their careers. Magnus followed Jennifer through the workspace, aware that conversations quieted as they passed and eyes followed their progress with undisguised curiosity. "This is yours," Jennifer announced, stopping beside a grey fabric cubicle that was smaller than the bathroom in Magnus's former penthouse. "Computer, phone and filing cabinet. Your first assignment is on your desk." Magnus looked at the stack of papers waiting for him, each page dense with market research data that needed to be organized, analyzed, and summarized. It was the kind of grunt work he used to assign to unpaid interns. Now it was his life's work. "Any questions?" Jennifer asked, though her tone suggested that questions would be viewed as weakness rather than curiosity. "No," Magnus replied. "I think I understand perfectly." "Good. I'll check on your progress around lunch." She turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and Mr. Kaiser, everyone here knows who you are and who you used to be. But in this office, you're nobody special. You're just another junior analyst who needs to prove he deserves to be here. I suggest you remember that." As Jennifer's footsteps faded into the general office noise, Magnus settled into his chair and stared at the stack of papers that represented his new reality. Around him, the other junior analysts worked with the focused intensity of people who believed their efforts mattered. Phone calls were made, reports were written, careers were slowly but steadily built. Magnus picked up the first document and began to read. Market analysis for a mid-sized manufacturing company considering expansion into Southeast Asian markets. The kind of straightforward business challenge he used to solve before breakfast. Now it would take him most of the morning just to understand the parameters of the problem. The hours crawled by with the persistence of water torture. Every few minutes, Magnus found himself looking up from his work to see Aziza's face on the financial news networks that played silently on monitors throughout the office. She was everywhere now, speaking at conferences, gracing magazine covers, being interviewed by world leaders who sought her counsel on matters of global economic policy. The lunch hour brought a temporary reprieve from the data analysis, but no relief from the psychological weight of his situation. Magnus sat alone in the building's food court, eating a sandwich from the discount vendor while surrounded by conversations about stock options and partnership tracks and all the professional ambitions that used to define his existence. "Excuse me, aren't you Magnus Kaiser?" The voice belonged to a young man in an expensive suit who had approached Magnus's table with the eager expression of someone about to witness a celebrity encounter. "I am," Magnus replied quietly. "Holy shit, man! I mean, sorry, but wow. I read about your company in business school. Kaiser Technologies was like legendary. What you did with quantum processing was revolutionary." The young man's enthusiasm was genuine and somehow made the encounter even more painful. "That was a long time ago," Magnus said, "but still, to go from that to, well, I heard you were working here now, but I didn't believe it." The young man looked around the food court as if trying to reconcile Magnus's former status with his current circumstances. "Man, life is crazy, you know. One day you're on top of the world. The next, you're exactly where you deserve to be," Magnus finished quietly. The afternoon brought more data analysis, more subtle reminders of his diminished status, and more glimpses of Aziza's face on the financial news networks. By 5 o'clock, Magnus felt like he'd aged a decade. His back ached from hunching over spreadsheets, his eyes burned from staring at computer screens, and his soul felt hollow as an empty church. "How was your first day?" Jennifer appeared at his cubicle as he was preparing to leave, her smile carrying the same professional courtesy that barely masked her amusement at his situation. "Educational," Magnus replied honestly. "Good. I've left tomorrow's assignments on your desk. Market research for 3 different clients, all due by end of business Wednesday." She paused, studying his face with the analytical attention of a scientist observing a lab rat. "You know, Mr. Kaiser, most people in your situation would be bitter, angry about their circumstances, resentful toward the people who put them here. But you seem almost accepting." Magnus considered her observation for a moment. "Anger is a luxury I can't afford, Miss Washington. Resentment requires energy I don't have. All I can do now is try to earn my place in whatever world I'm allowed to inhabit." Jennifer's expression shifted slightly, as if she was seeing him as a human being rather than a cautionary tale for the first time. That's surprisingly mature. Maturity is what you get when you lose everything and realize you deserve to lose it, Magnus replied, gathering his few belongings from the desk. As he waited for the elevator, Magnus caught sight of his reflection in the polished metal doors. The man looking back at him bore little resemblance to the arrogant mogul who had thrown divorce papers at his wife 9 months ago. This man was thinner, quieter, worn down by circumstances, but somehow more solid than his predecessor. The elevator arrived with a soft chime, and Magnus stepped inside for the ride down to street level. Tomorrow he would return to his cubicle, to his data analysis, to his role as a junior analyst in a company that existed at the pleasure of the woman he had once dismissed as ordinary. "How's our special employee adjusting?" he heard a familiar voice ask as the elevator doors began to close. Through the narrowing gap, he caught a glimpse of Aziza herself, standing in the lobby in a charcoal grey suit that probably cost more than his annual salary, speaking quietly to Jennifer Washington. The doors closed before he could hear Jennifer's response, but Magnus understood that his first day at Meridian Global had been a performance reviewed by the most important audience in the world. Somewhere above him, the woman he had once claimed to love was receiving reports on his progress like a scientist monitoring a long-term experiment. Chapter 5. The Lesson. Some people think rock bottom is the end of the story. Aziza knew it was just where the real education begins. The fluorescent lights of the Meridian Global research floor had become Magnus's sun and stars, marking the rhythm of days that blurred together in an endless cycle of data analysis and quiet humiliation. 6 months into his employment as a junior analyst, he had learned to navigate the delicate social ecosystem of people who knew exactly who he used to be and exactly how far he had fallen. His cubicle had become a strange sort of sanctuary, a grey fabric box where he could lose himself in spreadsheets and market research, where the complexity of global economics provided temporary escape from the complexity of his shattered life. The work itself wasn't challenging for someone who had once negotiated billion-dollar deals, but the psychological weight of performing it as a subordinate rather than a master made every task feel like lifting stones uphill. "Kaiser, I need the Southeast Asia manufacturing report by 3 o'clock, Jennifer Washington announced as she passed his cubicle, her voice carrying the casual authority of someone who had grown comfortable giving orders to a man who used to command boardrooms. "And make sure the cost projections include the new tariff structures. The client specifically requested comprehensive analysis." "Of course," Magnus replied without looking up from his computer screen. The deference in his own voice still surprised him sometimes, the automatic submission of someone who had learned that resistance only made survival more difficult. Around him, the other junior analysts worked with the focused energy of people climbing towards something better. Fresh graduates with perfect teeth and expensive educations, all of them building careers while he simply tried to maintain his tenuous grip on employment. They were polite enough, these young professionals, but their politeness carried the distant courtesy reserved for elderly relatives or former celebrities, acknowledgement without genuine interest. The financial news networks played silently on monitors throughout the office, a constant visual reminder of the world Magnus used to inhabit. And increasingly, those monitors showed the face that haunted his dreams and defined his waking hours. Aziza had become a media phenomenon, the mysterious heiress who had stepped out of the shadows to become the most photographed and interviewed businesswoman in the world. Today's coverage was particularly extensive. The lead story on every financial network featured Aziza's keynote address at the World Economic Forum, where she had announced Valentina Global's commitment to investing $500 billion in renewable energy infrastructure across developing nations. The camera caught her in profile as she spoke, her beauty rendered even more striking by the absolute confidence with which she commanded the attention of world leaders. Revolutionary Initiative by Valentina. Global promises to reshape global energy markets, the Chiron read, while footage showed presidents and prime ministers hanging on her every word. Magnus found himself staring at the screen, despite his efforts to focus on the manufacturing report. There was something almost hypnotic about watching Aziza in her element, speaking with the natural authority that had been hers all along, but which he had been too blind and too arrogant to recognize. She moved through that world of ultimate power as if she had been born to it, which of course she had. Pretty amazing, isn't it? The voice belonged to David Park, one of the other junior analysts who shared Magnus's cubicle cluster. He was 24 years old, brilliant in the way that only came from growing up with unlimited access to information, and possessed of the casual confidence that characterized his generation. "What's that?" Magnus asked. "Aziza Valentina. I mean, Jesus, can you imagine being married to someone like that and not knowing who she really was?" David shook his head in amazement. "I read that Forbes interview like 10 times. The way she talks about hiding her identity to see if her husband could love her for herself. That's like something out of a movie." Magnus's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice neutral. "I suppose. And the guy she was married to, Kaiser, right? What a fucking idiot. Sorry, I know you have the same last name, but no relation, right?" David's question was innocent enough, but Magnus could feel the weight of potential revelation pressing down on him like a physical force. "No relation," Magnus lied smoothly. "Well, whoever he was, he had to be the stupidest man alive. I mean, you're married to the most powerful woman in the world, and you treat her like she's beneath you. That's not just arrogance, that's like criminal stupidity." Around them, other conversations had quieted as their colleagues tuned in to David's commentary. Magnus could feel eyes on him, studying his reaction to this discussion of his former life. Some of them knew he was certain. The resemblance between his professional biography and the story Aziza had told in her interviews was too close to be coincidental. "I heard he's working as like a data entry clerk somewhere," added Sarah Kim, another junior analyst whose family connections had gotten her the position straight out of Harvard. "Can you imagine going from running a major tech company to basically being an intern? I almost feel sorry for the guy." "I don't," David replied firmly. "He had everything: money, success, and apparently the love of the most extraordinary woman on the planet. And he threw it away because he couldn't handle the idea that his wife might be more important than him. That's not tragedy, that's justice." Magnus bent his head lower over his computer screen, hoping to end the conversation through body language alone. But David was warming to his subject, energized by the attention of his colleagues. "You know what gets me? She could have destroyed him the moment he asked for the divorce. One phone call and poof, no more Kaiser technologies. But instead, she gave him months to figure it out on his own. That's either incredible mercy or incredible cruelty, depending on how you look at it. Maybe both," suggested Jennifer Washington, who had returned from her meeting and was now standing at the edge of their cubicle cluster. "Sometimes the most merciful thing you can do for someone is teach them consequences they've never had to face." Her eyes met Magnus's for just a moment, and in that brief contact he saw recognition and something that might have been sympathy. Jennifer knew exactly who he was, had known from his first day, but had maintained the fiction of his anonymity as carefully as he had. "Anyway," David continued, oblivious to the undercurrents swirling around him, "I just think it's fascinating how the whole thing played out. Like a modern fairy tale, except the prince turned out to be a frog, and the princess turned out to be the queen of everything." The conversation finally drifted to other topics, leaving Magnus alone with his spreadsheets and his thoughts. He worked steadily through the afternoon, compiling data and preparing analysis with the mechanical precision of someone who had learned that competence was his only remaining currency. The work itself provided a strange kind of solace, problems that could be solved through research and logic, challenges that didn't require him to confront the larger questions of identity and worth that haunted his off hours. At precisely 3 o'clock, he delivered the completed Southeast Asia manufacturing report to Jennifer's office, placing it on her desk with the careful attention of someone who understood that even small failures could have large consequences. "Thank you," she said, without looking up from her computer. Then, after a pause, "Magnus, can you close the door for a moment?" The use of his first name was unusual enough to make him nervous. In the office, he was always Kaiser or Mr. Kaiser, professional distance maintained through formal address. Magnus closed the door and returned to stand before Jennifer's desk like a student called to the principal's office. "I want you to know that your work has been exemplary," Jennifer began. "Your analysis is thorough, your reports are well written, and you haven't missed a single deadline in 6 months. Under normal circumstances, I'd be recommending you for promotion to senior analyst." Magnus waited for the but that he knew was coming. "But these aren't normal circumstances, are they?" Jennifer's smile was gentle but implacable. "You're not here because you're qualified for promotion. You're here because someone wants you to understand what it feels like to be at the bottom of a hierarchy you used to control." "I understand that," Magnus said quietly. "Do you?" "Because I'm not sure you understand the full scope of what's happening here." Jennifer leaned back in her chair, studying him with the analytical attention she usually reserved for market data. "Every report you write gets copied to a very specific recipient. Every evaluation I submit about your performance goes to the same place. Someone is tracking your progress with the attention most people reserve for their stock portfolios." Magnus felt his chest tighten. "Aziza, Miss Valentina has taken a very personal interest in your professional development." Jennifer's tone was carefully neutral, but Magnus could hear the subtext. "The question is, why do you think that is?" It was a question Magnus had been avoiding for 6 months, a puzzle he was afraid to solve because he suspected the answer would be more painful than ignorance. Why keep him close enough to watch but far enough to suffer? Why orchestrate his employment rather than simply destroying him completely? "I don't know," he admitted. "I think you do," Jennifer replied. "I think you know exactly why someone who could erase you from existence with a phone call would instead choose to give you a job analyzing manufacturing costs in Southeast Asia." The truth sat between them like a loaded weapon, dangerous to handle, but impossible to ignore. Magnus had understood for months that this wasn't just employment. This was observation. This was an experiment in human behavior, a long-term study in whether someone who had never learned humility could acquire it through circumstances. "She's watching to see if I'll change," he said finally. "She's watching to see if you're capable of change," Jennifer corrected. "There's a difference." Magnus nodded slowly. "And what have you been reporting?" Jennifer's smile was enigmatic. "That's between Ms. Valentina and me. But I will say this, the man who started here 6 months ago is not the same man sitting in my office today." As Magnus returned to his cubicle, he caught sight of Aziza's face on the financial news monitors once again. This time, the coverage showed her boarding a private jet, probably heading to another conference where world leaders would seek her guidance on matters of global importance. She moved with fluid grace up the aircraft steps, every gesture economical and purposeful, every movement that of someone comfortable with unlimited power. The Chiron read, "Valentina Global announces record quarterly profits." But Magnus wasn't reading the headlines. He was studying the woman in the footage, trying to reconcile this queen of international finance with the wife who used to read novels by their fireplace. While he explained market dynamics, she understood better than he ever would. "The man who never learned to bow must first learn to crawl," he whispered to himself, remembering words that seemed to have been spoken in another lifetime. Chapter 6. The Revelation. True power whispers while weakness screams, and Magnus had been screaming since the divorce. The envelope arrived on the exact anniversary of their wedding, delivered not to his queen's apartment, but to his desk at Meridian Global, placed precisely in the center of his workspace where he couldn't possibly miss it. Magnus stared at the cream-colored paper with its embossed Valentina Global logo, his hands trembling slightly as he recognized the elegant script that spelled out his name. 1 year, exactly 1 year, since he had promised to love and honor the woman whose true identity he had never bothered to discover. Exactly 1 year since he had pledged himself to someone he had spent 4 years treating like a beautiful accessory to his life. The timing of the envelope's arrival was no coincidence. Nothing in his life had been coincidental since Christmas Eve. Around him, the familiar sounds of the office continued. Phone conversations, keyboard clicks, the soft hum of productivity that had become the soundtrack to his diminished existence. But Magnus felt separated from it all by the weight of possibility contained in the unopened envelope. After 12 months of silence, Aziza was reaching out to him directly for the first time. His fingers shook as he opened the envelope, revealing a single sheet of paper that bore only an address and a time. 7 p.m. Come alone. No signature, no explanation, just coordinates for a meeting that could reshape his understanding of everything. The address was in Manhattan, in a neighborhood of old money and older secrets. Where buildings existed behind wrought iron gates and privacy was purchased by the acre rather than the square foot. Magnus had been to parties in houses like these during his previous life, back when he was important enough to warrant invitations to gatherings of the truly wealthy. The rest of the workday passed in a haze of distraction. Magnus completed his assignments with mechanical precision, while his mind churned through possibilities and fears. What did Aziza want? Why now? Why break a year of silence to request a meeting that felt more like a summons? Jennifer Washington appeared at his cubicle as he was preparing to leave, her expression unreadable but somehow knowing. "Early day today, Kaiser?" "I have an appointment," Magnus replied, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "I'm sure you do." Her smile was enigmatic. "Word of advice?" "Listen more than you speak. You might be surprised by what you learn." The subway ride into Manhattan felt like a journey through time, each stop carrying him further from the man he had become and closer to the man he used to be. The neighborhoods grew more expensive, the buildings taller, the very air seeming to carry more possibility as he approached the coordinates Aziza had provided. The address led to a brownstone that whispered of old money and older power, its facade elegant but understated in the way that only came from generations of wealth. A doorman in livery stood at attention as Magnus approached, his face professionally neutral as he consulted a list. "Mr. Kaiser, you're expected. 4th floor, private elevator." The interior of the building was a masterpiece of understated luxury. Marble floors that had probably been quarried in Italy, artwork that belonged in museums, and silence so complete it seemed to have weight. The private elevator rose soundlessly, carrying Magnus toward a meeting that felt like destiny. The elevator opened directly into a penthouse office that took his breath away. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Manhattan, while the space itself radiated the kind of power that couldn't be bought or borrowed, only inherited and carefully cultivated across generations. Original paintings hung on walls lined with first-edition books, and furniture that looked like it belonged in the Palace of Versailles created intimate conversation areas within the larger space. Aziza stood with her back to him at the far window, her silhouette sharp against the city lights. She wore a midnight blue dress that hugged her figure like liquid shadow, her hair pulled back in a style that emphasized the elegant curve of her neck. She looked like power incarnate, like wealth given human form, like everything Magnus had thrown away, wrapped in beauty that could stop hearts. "You came," she said without turning around, her voice carrying the same silk-wrapped steel quality that had haunted his dreams for 12 months. "You summoned," Magnus replied, then immediately regretted the words. They sounded too familiar, too presumptuous for someone in his position. Aziza's laugh was soft and terrible. "Summoned? Is that what you think this is?" She turned to face him, and Magnus felt his knees nearly buckle under the full force of her presence. This was not the woman he had married. That woman had been a performance, a carefully constructed fiction designed to make him comfortable with loving someone he believed was beneath him. This was Aziza Valentina in her true form, and she was magnificent in the way that natural disasters were magnificent, beautiful, terrible, and utterly beyond human control. "Sit," she said, gesturing to a chair positioned strategically to face both her and the window, with its commanding view of the city. Magnus sat, acutely aware of how his discount suit and cheap shoes looked in this space of unlimited luxury. Everything about the setting was designed to remind him of the vast distance between who he was now and who she had always been. "Do you know why you're here?" Aziza asked, moving to stand behind an antique desk that had probably belonged to robber barons and railroad magnates. "To be educated," Magnus replied honestly. "To learn whatever lesson you've designed this meeting to teach." Her smile was sharp enough to cut diamonds. "Very good. 12 months of humility have taught you something, haven't they?" She opened a folder on the desk and withdrew a series of photographs, laying them out like tarot cards, predicting a very specific future. Magnus recognized them immediately. Images from his previous life, pictures of him at business dinners and corporate events, always with beautiful women who weren't his wife. 18 months, Aziza said quietly. 18 months of you telling me you were working late while you were actually working late on other relationships. Magnus felt shame burn through his chest like acid. "Aziza, 18 months of you explaining to me why your business trips were necessary while you were conducting very different kinds of business in hotel rooms I was paying for." She placed another photograph on the desk, this one showing Magnus entering a hotel with a woman whose face he barely remembered. 18 months of you making me feel like I wasn't enough for you while you were cheating on me with women who weren't worthy to polish my shoes. Each image was another nail in the coffin of whatever dignity Magnus had managed to preserve. He stared at the evidence of his betrayals, remembering the arrogance that had made them seem justified at the time. He had told himself that he deserved the attention, that Aziza was too quiet and bookish to satisfy his need for excitement, that successful men were expected to have certain appetites. "Did you know that I knew?" Aziza asked, her voice carrying the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. "Did you imagine that the most powerful woman in the world wouldn't have sources everywhere, wouldn't know exactly how her husband was spending his time and her money?" Magnus looked up from the photographs to meet her eyes, and what he saw there wasn't anger or hurt. It was something far worse. It was the cold assessment of a scientist studying a particularly disappointing specimen. "I knew about every affair," she continued, "every lie. Every time you came home to me, smelling like another woman's perfume, and told me you'd been in budget meetings. I knew about the hotel rooms and the restaurant meals and the jewelry you bought for secretaries with credit cards connected to accounts I ultimately controlled." "Then why didn't you say anything?" The question escaped him before he could stop it. "Because I was curious." Aziza's smile was beautiful and terrible. "I wanted to see how far you would go. I wanted to understand the depths of the contempt you felt for the woman who loved you enough to pretend to be less than she was." She moved around the desk to stand directly in front of him, and Magnus caught the scent of her perfume, something expensive and complex that probably cost more than his monthly salary. "I created an entire false identity so you could love me without feeling intimidated by my family's power." I spent 4 years playing the role of a supportive wife who was impressed by your small accomplishments and grateful for your attention. I made myself smaller so you could feel larger. Her voice never rose above a conversational tone, but each word carried the weight of absolute judgment. And you repaid that love by treating me like I was so worthless that cheating on me didn't even require creativity. Magnus wanted to defend himself, to explain the pressures he had felt and the isolation that had driven him to seek connection elsewhere. But sitting in this palace of power, looking at this woman who commanded the attention of world leaders, he realized how pathetic any explanation would sound. "I'm sorry," he said finally. The words inadequate but genuine. "Are you?" Aziza tilted her head, studying him with the attention a jeweler might give to a potentially valuable stone. "Are you sorry for what you did, or are you sorry that you're facing consequences?" It was a question that cut to the heart of everything Magnus had been avoiding for 12 months. Was his contrition real, or was it simply the psychological adaptation of someone who had learned that survival required submission? "Both," he admitted. "I'm sorry for what I did because it was wrong. And I'm sorry about the consequences because they've shown me what I really am." "And what are you, Magnus?" He looked around the penthouse office, taking in the evidence of power beyond his comprehension, then back at the woman who wielded it with such casual authority. "I'm a man who was given everything and understood nothing. A man who mistook luck for talent and possession for love." The words came from some deep place he hadn't known existed. "I'm a man who spent 4 years married to a queen while treating her like a servant." Aziza nodded slowly. "That's the first honest thing you've said to me in 5 years. She returned to her position behind the desk, creating physical distance that somehow felt more intimate than proximity had. "One more question," she said. "If you could go back to Christmas Eve, knowing what you know now, what would you do differently?" Magnus considered the question seriously, thinking through all the moments of blindness and arrogance that had led to his destruction. There were so many answers. He would ask about her family, he would pay attention to her intelligence, he would treat her as an equal rather than an ornament. But all of those were symptoms of a deeper failure. "I would ask you to teach me how to love you properly," he said finally, "instead of assuming I already knew." For the first time since he had arrived, something shifted in Aziza's expression. The mask of cold authority slipped just slightly, revealing something that might have been vulnerability or might have been hope. "That," she said quietly, "is the second honest thing you've said to me in 5 years. She gathered up the photographs, returning them to the folder with movements that seemed almost ritualistic. "Your education isn't complete, Magnus. But tonight you've shown me that it might actually be possible." As she walked him to the elevator, their footsteps echoing in the marble hallway, Magnus felt something he hadn't experienced in over a year, the faint possibility that redemption might be more than just a word in old books. "Did you ever actually love me?" he asked as the elevator doors began to open. The question he had been afraid to ask for 12 months, finally finding voice. Aziza looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable in the dim light of the hallway. "The man I loved never really existed, did he? He was as much a fiction as the woman you married. But sometimes—" She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "Sometimes I wonder if he could exist, if both of us stopped pretending to be less than we are." The elevator doors closed between them, carrying Magnus down through the building and back toward his diminished life. But for the first time since Christmas Eve, he felt like he was moving toward something, rather than simply falling away from everything he had lost. Chapter 7. The Transformation. Rock bottom became the foundation upon which Magnus finally started building something real, or so he desperately hoped. The promotion came without fanfare, announced in a company-wide email that treated Magnus Kaiser's advancement to senior market analyst as routine personnel news rather than the remarkable transformation it actually represented. After 18 months of data entry and report compilation, Magnus found himself with his own office, a secretary, and junior analysts who looked to him for guidance on projects that actually mattered to Meridian Global's bottom line. The office was small but real. 4 walls, a door that closed, a window that offered a slice of Manhattan's skyline. After 18 months in a cubicle, it felt like a palace. Magnus sat behind his new desk, staring at business cards that bore his name and title, still hardly believing that he had climbed even this small distance back toward relevance. Congratulations. Jennifer Washington stood in his doorway, her expression mixing professional courtesy with something that might have been genuine respect. Senior analyst is a significant step up. Your work has been exemplary. Thank you, Magnus replied, then hesitated. Jennifer, why now? Why this promotion when you've made it clear that my presence here serves purposes beyond normal employment? Jennifer stepped into the office and closed the door behind her. Because you've changed, she said simply. The man who started here 18 months ago was performing humility because he had to. You've learned to actually be humble because you understand why it matters. She moved to the window, looking out at the city. Do you remember your first day, when David Park was talking about Aziza Valentina's ex-husband being an idiot? Magnus winced at the memory. Yes, I watched your face during that conversation. I saw shame, embarrassment, anger at being discussed that way. But more than that, I saw recognition. You knew they were right. Jennifer turned to face him directly. That was the beginning of real change, the moment when you stopped defending who you used to be and started confronting it. Does she know about the promotion? Magnus asked. Miss Valentina knows everything that happens in this company, Jennifer replied diplomatically. But the promotion was earned, Magnus. Your analysis of the Latin American markets was genuinely brilliant. Your insights into the Southeast Asian supply chain disruptions saved our clients millions of dollars. You're being promoted because you've become someone worth promoting. The distinction mattered more than Magnus had expected. For 18 months, every opportunity had felt like charity. But this promotion carried the weight of genuine accomplishment. There's something else, Jennifer continued. You've been selected to represent Meridian at the Global Economic Summit next month. It's a significant assignment, major clients, important presentations, the kind of visibility that can define a career. Magnus felt his chest tighten with excitement and terror. The Global Economic Summit was where world leaders and industry titans gathered to shape the future of international commerce. Will she be there? He asked quietly. Miss Valentina keynotes the opening session, Jennifer replied. But you'll be representing our clients' interests, not performing in anyone's personal drama. The question is, are you ready for that level of responsibility? Magnus considered the question seriously. I think I am, he said finally. Not because I'm the same person who used to attend these events, but because I'm someone different. Someone who understands that being right matters more than being recognized for being right. Jennifer's smile was the first genuinely warm expression he had seen from her in 18 months. That's exactly the answer I was hoping for. The weeks leading up to the summit passed in preparation and nervous energy. Magnus threw himself into research with the intensity of someone who understood that this was more than an assignment. It was a test of whether he had truly learned the lessons his fall was meant to teach. The Global Economic Summit was held in Geneva, in a conference center that had witnessed the reshaping of empires. Magnus arrived early, walking through venues that had once felt like natural habitat, but now seemed foreign and intimidating. The delegates moved with the confident energy of people accustomed to power. And everywhere, like background music, he heard Aziza's name. She had become the unofficial star of the summit, the mysterious heiress whose rare public appearances drew crowds of world leaders seeking her counsel. The opening ceremony filled the main auditorium with 1,500 of the most powerful people on Earth. Magnus sat in the section reserved for corporate representatives, surrounded by executives whose companies shaped global commerce. When Aziza took the podium for her keynote address, the auditorium fell into the kind of silence usually reserved for religious services. She wore a charcoal grey suit that managed to project both authority and elegance, but it was her presence that truly commanded attention. The effortless confidence of someone who had been born to stand on stages like this. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying easily through the vast space, "we gather here at a moment when the old certainties no longer serve us, and the new realities demand courage we may not possess." Magnus found himself leaning forward, drawn into her words, despite everything that lay between them. This was Aziza in her element, speaking with the authority that came from controlling resources that dwarfed the GDP of most nations. "The question before us is not whether change will come," she continued. "The question is whether we will shape that change or be shaped by it, whether we will lead with wisdom or follow with regret." As she spoke, Magnus caught himself remembering moments from their marriage, quiet evenings when she had offered observations about market trends that he had dismissed as naive. How many times had he explained economics to someone who understood global finance better than anyone in the room? "The greatest tragedy," Aziza said, her voice seeming to speak directly to him, "is not falling short of our potential, but failing to recognize potential when it stands before us." The address concluded to thunderous applause. Magnus clapped along with everyone else, but his applause carried a different weight, the recognition of loss that went far beyond financial ruin. The rest of the summit passed in a blur of presentations and networking. Magnus delivered his analysis of emerging markets to audiences that actually listened, offered recommendations that were received with genuine interest. For the first time in 2 years, he felt like he was contributing something valuable rather than simply occupying space. On the final evening, the summit concluded with a reception. Magnus nursed a single glass of wine, watching power brokers navigate social dynamics that would influence international relations for years. "You've changed," a familiar voice said behind him. Magnus turned to find Aziza approaching, having somehow separated herself from the crowd of advisors who normally surrounded her. She wore a midnight blue evening gown that managed to be both elegant and intimidating. "Have I?" Magnus asked. "The man I married would have spent this entire reception trying to convince important people that he belonged in their conversations. You've been standing here for an hour listening." She moved to stand beside him. "That's not a small change." They stood in comfortable silence, watching diplomats conduct the kind of informal negotiations that often mattered more than formal treaties. Magnus was acutely aware of Aziza's presence, the subtle scent of her perfume, the quiet confidence that radiated from her like heat. "I saw your presentation," she said finally. "Your analysis of the African infrastructure opportunities was remarkably insightful." "Thank you," Magnus replied, then hesitated. "I learned from the best teacher I've ever had, even if I was too stupid to realize I was being taught." Aziza's laugh was soft and genuine. "Flattery doesn't suit you, Magnus. Honesty does." "Then honestly, watching you speak today, seeing you in your true element, I finally understand what I threw away." He turned to face her directly. "I was married to someone who could have taught me everything I thought I knew, and instead I spent 4 years lecturing her about subjects she understood better than I ever will. And what do you understand now that you didn't then?" Magnus considered the question. "I understand that wisdom isn't the same as intelligence, that strength isn't the same as power, that loving someone means seeing them clearly, not seeing what you wish they were." Aziza nodded slowly. "That's progress. Is it enough?" The question escaped before he could stop it. Aziza studied his face for a long moment. "That remains to be seen." She began to move away, then paused. "Magnus, the man who gave that presentation today, who listened instead of talking, who learned instead of assuming. That man has potential. As she disappeared back into the crowd, Magnus stood alone, feeling something he hadn't experienced since Christmas Eve 2 years ago, the possibility that he might be becoming someone worth loving. Chapter 8. The Understanding. Love isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about becoming someone worthy of the love you seek. The executive conference room at Meridian Global had witnessed many important meetings, but none quite like the one convening on this crisp autumn morning. Magnus sat at the polished mahogany table, reviewing documents that would determine the future of 3 major corporations and affect the livelihoods of approximately 50,000 employees across 4 continents. The Jakarta manufacturing facility is operating at 60% capacity, reported Sarah Kim, who had become Magnus's most trusted analyst since his promotion to senior director. Political instability and supply chain disruptions are creating significant challenges for our clients' production schedules. Magnus studied the charts and projections, his mind working through the complex interplay of political risk, economic opportunity, and human cost that defined modern global commerce. The old Magnus would have seen only numbers and profit margins. This version understood that behind every statistic were real people whose lives would be affected by whatever recommendations emerged from this room. "What are the alternatives?" he asked. "We could recommend shifting production to the Philippine facility, but that would mean job losses in Indonesia," Sarah replied. "Or we could suggest maintaining current operations while investing in additional security measures and local infrastructure development." Cost analysis on both options. Short-term, the Philippine shift is more profitable. Long-term, the Indonesian investment creates better market positioning and stronger local relationships. Sarah pulled up additional spreadsheets. But it also requires our clients to accept lower quarterly returns in exchange for sustainable growth. Magnus nodded, appreciating both the thoroughness of the analysis and the ethical complexity it revealed. This was the kind of decision that separated genuine leadership from mere profit optimization. Schedule meetings with all 3 clients, he decided. Present both options with complete transparency about costs, benefits, and human impact. Let them make informed decisions rather than just recommending the most immediately profitable path. As the meeting concluded, Magnus remained in the conference room, staring out at the Manhattan skyline through windows that had once seemed impossibly distant during his cubicle days. 2 years of systematic humiliation had taught him lessons about power and responsibility that all his previous success had never touched. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Turn on Channel 7, now!" Magnus reached for the remote control, switching the wall-mounted television to the business news network. The screen filled with a familiar image that made his chest tighten. Aziza sat across from a respected financial journalist, discussing global economic trends with the casual authority that had become her trademark. "Miss Valentina," the interviewer was saying, "your company's decision to maintain operations in politically unstable regions while other corporations are pulling out has drawn criticism from shareholders focused on quarterly profits. How do you respond?" Aziza's smile was patient but steely. "Short-term thinking is the enemy of sustainable prosperity. When we withdraw from challenging markets at the first sign of difficulty, we abandon not just potential profits, but our responsibility to the communities that have partnered with us." Magnus found himself leaning forward, drawn into her reasoning despite the personal history that complicated everything. This was the woman he had dismissed as financially naive, discussing economic strategy with nuance that most business school professors couldn't match. "But surely your primary obligation is to your investors," the journalist pressed. "Our primary obligation is to the future," Aziza replied. Investors benefit more from companies that build lasting value than from those that maximize quarterly returns at the expense of everything else. The most profitable investments are often those that require patience, vision, and the willingness to do what's right rather than what's easy. As the interview concluded, Magnus realized he was witnessing a demonstration of the principles that guided someone who wielded genuine power. Not the crude dominance he had once mistaken for leadership, but the sophisticated understanding of interconnection and consequence that defined true authority. His phone buzzed again. Another text from the same unknown number. Conference room B, 5 minutes. Magnus's heart rate accelerated as he made his way through the Meridian Global offices toward the smaller conference room. The hallway seemed longer than usual, each step carrying him toward an encounter he had been anticipating and dreading in equal measure. Conference room B was empty when he arrived. Magnus stood uncertainly in the doorway until movement in his peripheral vision drew his attention to the corner where shadows played tricks with depth perception. Aziza emerged from the alcove where she had been waiting, her presence transforming the mundane conference room into something that felt charged with possibility. She wore a navy blue suit that managed to project both professionalism and devastating beauty. "Hello, Magnus," she said quietly. Aziza. Her name felt strange on his lips after 2 years of thinking it, but never speaking it aloud. They stood at opposite ends of the conference room, separated by polished wood and the accumulated weight of everything that lay between them. "I saw your recommendation about the Indonesian facility," Aziza said finally, "choosing long-term sustainability over immediate profit margins. That's not a decision the old Magnus would have made. The old Magnus never understood the difference between being successful and being responsible," he replied. "It took losing everything to learn that profit without purpose is just sophisticated theft." Aziza's smile was barely perceptible, but seemed to illuminate the entire room. "That's a remarkable evolution for someone who once explained to me why quarterly earnings were more important than employee welfare." The reference hit Magnus like a physical blow, not because it was cruel, but because it was accurate. He had indeed spent dinner conversations lecturing her about prioritizing shareholder returns, never realizing that the woman nodding politely controlled more shareholder value than he could calculate. "I remember those conversations," he said quietly. "I remember thinking I was educating you about business realities. Now I realize you were letting me demonstrate my own ignorance." "You weren't ignorant, Magnus. You were incomplete." Aziza moved closer. "Intelligence without wisdom, knowledge without understanding, success without purpose. And now you're beginning to understand what power actually means." She gestured toward the window. "It's not about controlling other people or accumulating resources for their own sake. It's about accepting responsibility for consequences that extend beyond your own immediate interests." Magnus nodded, thinking about the decision he had made that morning. "I used to think power was about getting people to do what you wanted. Now I think it might be about doing what needs to be done, whether people want it or not." "That's closer to the truth," Aziza agreed. "But there's still something missing from your understanding." "What's that?" She moved closer still, close enough that he could catch the subtle scent of her perfume, could see the intelligence that had always burned in her dark eyes, but which he had been too blind and too arrogant to recognize. Power without love is just sophisticated cruelty, and love without power is just beautiful helplessness. Her voice carried the weight of someone who had learned to balance both forces. The most dangerous people in the world are those who wield power without understanding love. The most useless are those who understand love, but have no power to protect it. Magnus felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that went deeper than intellectual understanding. This was the lesson that all his education in humility had been preparing him for. Not just how to be less arrogant or more competent, but how to integrate strength and vulnerability in ways that served something larger than himself. "I destroyed our marriage because I couldn't love someone I thought was weaker than me," he said slowly. "But I was wrong about which one of us was weak." "You were wrong about what strength means," Aziza corrected gently. "I let myself become smaller so you could feel larger, and that wasn't love. That was enabling. Real love requires both people to be as strong as they're capable of being." The observation hung between them like a bridge across a chasm that had seemed unbridgeable for 2 years. Magnus understood now that their marriage had failed, not because he was strong and she was weak, but because neither of them had been willing to be genuinely strong in ways that mattered. "If we had met now," he said carefully, "if we met as the people we are today, rather than the people we were pretending to be, do you think it could have worked?" Aziza's smile was sad and beautiful, and full of possibilities that might never be tested. "I think we're about to find out whether it's possible for two people to meet again as themselves, rather than as their illusions." She moved toward the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. Magnus, the man who made that decision about Indonesia, who chose responsibility over profit, that man has something the old Magnus never possessed. What's that? The capacity to love someone stronger than himself. She opened the door, letting in light from the hallway. The question is whether he has the courage to try. As she left him alone in the conference room, Magnus stood motionless for several minutes, staring out at the city that had witnessed his fall and was now watching his resurrection. For the first time in 2 years, he felt like he might be becoming someone worthy of the love he had thrown away. Chapter 9. The invitation. Some doors open only once. Others require you to prove you've learned how to knock properly. The letter arrived precisely 2 years after the divorce papers, delivered to Magnus's apartment on Christmas Eve, with the same ceremonial timing that had marked every significant milestone in his journey from arrogance to understanding. But this envelope was different: heavier paper, more elegant script, and sealed with wax that bore the Valentina family crest in deep burgundy relief. Magnus held the letter in hands that trembled slightly, not from nerves, but from the recognition that this moment represented a culmination of everything he had learned and lost and fought to rebuild. 2 years of systematic humiliation had led to this envelope, this moment, this possibility that felt too fragile to examine too closely. The apartment around him bore little resemblance to the studio hovel he had inhabited during his deepest fall. Success as a senior director at Meridian Global had afforded him a one-bedroom place in a respectable neighborhood, furnished with items that projected quiet competence rather than desperate poverty. It wasn't luxury, but it was dignity, a space that reflected who he was becoming rather than who he had been. The wax seal broke with a soft crack, revealing paper so fine it seemed to glow in the lamplight. Aziza's handwriting flowed across the page in elegant script. "Magnus, 2 years ago you asked me to find someone suitable to my station. Tonight I'm wondering if such a person might already exist, hidden beneath layers of experience that have taught him what love actually requires. I'm hosting a small gathering on New Year's Eve. Not the kind of party that makes society pages, but an intimate dinner for people who understand that real power comes from the courage to be vulnerable with those who matter most. If you choose to attend, come prepared for a conversation that might change everything between us. If you choose not to attend, I'll understand that some bridges are too damaged to rebuild. The choice is yours. But understand this: if you come as yourself, not as who you used to be or who you think I want you to be, but as exactly who you are right now." Address enclosed. 8 o'clock. Come alone, Aziza. Magnus read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of meaning and invitation. This wasn't a summons or a test, but an offering, the possibility of meeting each other as the people they had become, rather than the people they had pretended to be. New Year's Eve arrived with crystalline clarity. Magnus dressed with the care of someone preparing for the most important meeting of his life. A charcoal suit that projected quiet confidence, shoes polished to mirror brightness. He looked like a man who had learned to dress for himself rather than to impress others. The Valentina estate occupied several hundred acres of prime Long Island real estate, its main house rising like something from a different century. Warm light spilled from windows that faced manicured gardens, and Magnus could see shadows moving within, other guests who had been deemed worthy of inclusion. The library was a masterpiece of understated elegance, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, comfortable seating arrangements, and a fireplace large enough to warm a cathedral. Perhaps a dozen people moved through the space with the easy confidence of those accustomed to wielding serious power. Magnus recognized faces from financial news networks and international relations textbooks, a former Secretary of State, the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, a tech entrepreneur whose innovations had revolutionized global communications. These were people whose decisions affected millions of lives, and moving among them with effortless grace was Aziza, wearing a midnight blue evening gown that managed to be both elegant and devastating. She caught sight of him as he entered, and her smile carried warmth that made his chest tighten with possibilities. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "I'd like you to meet Magnus Kaiser, Senior Director of Strategic Analysis at Meridian Global." The introduction was perfectly crafted, acknowledging his current position without reference to his past failures, presenting him as someone worthy of inclusion in this rarefied company. Magnus found himself engaging in conversations that ranged from monetary policy to climate change to the social responsibility of multinational corporations. Throughout the evening, he remained aware of Aziza's presence, the way she moved through the room like a conductor orchestrating a complex symphony, how she listened to different perspectives before offering observations that invariably illuminated new dimensions of whatever problem was being discussed. As the evening wound toward midnight, guests began to drift toward their cars. Magnus lingered in the library, unsure whether he should leave with the others or wait for some signal from his hostess. "Thank you for coming," Aziza said softly, appearing beside him. "Thank you for inviting me. Though I'm not entirely sure why I was included in such distinguished company, because you've become someone worth including." She moved to stand before the fireplace. 2 years ago, you would have spent this evening trying to prove you belonged here. Tonight you simply belonged. The observation was accurate. He had felt comfortable among people whose power dwarfed his own, had contributed to conversations without feeling the need to dominate them. "The man who was here tonight," Aziza continued, "who discussed infrastructure development with genuine concern for human impact, who asked thoughtful questions rather than making grand pronouncements. That man is someone I might be able to love." The words hung between them like a bridge across a chasm that had seemed unbridgeable for 2 years. Magnus felt his heart rate accelerate. "Might be able to," he repeated carefully. "There are still questions that need answers, still tests that remain to be passed, still bridges that need to be built rather than simply repaired." She moved closer. "But for the first time since Christmas Eve, I'm willing to explore the possibility that we might meet each other as ourselves rather than as our illusions." "What happens next?" he asked. Aziza's smile was mysterious and full of promise. "That depends on whether you're prepared for the most difficult conversation of your life. Whether you're ready to confront not just what you did wrong, but what you need to do right. Whether you can handle loving someone who will never again pretend to be less than she is." As midnight approached, the grandfather clock began to chime. Around them, the empty mansion seemed to hold its breath. "There's something you need to understand before we go any further," Aziza said. "If we attempt this reconstruction, it won't be a return to what we had before. It will be the creation of something entirely new, built on terms that you may find challenging." She moved to a side table where champagne waited. "Tomorrow evening, if you choose to accept it, you'll receive an invitation to a very different kind of conversation, one where all the pretense gets stripped away." Magnus accepted the champagne she offered. "And if I'm not ready for that level of truth, then you'll discover that some doors only open once, and this was your moment." Her smile was beautiful and terrible. "But if you are ready, if you're finally prepared to meet the real Aziza Valentina on her own terms." The clock finished its midnight chiming, and fireworks began to explode over the Long Island Sound, celebrating the birth of a new year. "Then you might discover what it actually means to be loved by an empress," Aziza finished, raising her glass. "The question is, are you prepared to beg properly this time?" Chapter 10. The Empress's Terms. Power without mercy is tyranny. Mercy without conditions is suicide. Aziza Valentina had never been accused of either. The conservatory felt different in the harsh morning light, its grandeur more intimidating than inviting. Magnus approached, knowing this was the final reckoning. Whatever remained of his relationship with the most powerful woman in the world would be decided in the next hour. Aziza stood among exotic orchids and jasmine, wearing a simple white dress that somehow projected more authority than any formal gown. The morning light streaming through glass walls created patterns across her face as she moved among flowers, whose care probably cost more than most people's salaries. "Sit," she said without turning around, her voice carrying absolute command. Magnus settled into a wrought iron chair. The conservatory's humid air felt heavy with consequence. "Do you know why you're here?" she asked, finally turning to face him. "To learn what comes next, to discover whether redemption is possible, or if some mistakes are too fundamental to overcome." Redemption. Aziza tasted the word like wine that might have turned to vinegar. What an interesting choice. It suggests you believe you deserve forgiveness, that your transformation has earned you something. "I don't know what I deserve," Magnus said honestly. "I only know what I hope for." "And what do you hope for, Magnus?" "I'm with the chance to love you properly this time, to see you clearly instead of seeing what I wished you were, to be worthy of someone who was always out of my league." Aziza's smile was sharp as diamond. "Love. Do you know what love actually requires, Magnus? I'm beginning to understand." "Are you?" She moved closer. "Because I'm not convinced you comprehend what you're asking for when you speak of loving me properly." She gestured around the conservatory with its impossible flowers. "This is not a fairy tale. I'm not a princess waiting to be rescued. I'm the most powerful woman in the world. And love with someone like me operates according to rules that would terrify most men." Magnus felt his throat constrict. "I'm listening." Loving me means accepting that you will never again be the most important person in any room we enter together. It means understanding that your opinions will carry weight only insofar as they demonstrate wisdom rather than mere intelligence. It means being comfortable knowing I could buy and sell your entire industry before breakfast. Each word cut away illusions about what their relationship might look like. It means accepting that I will travel to meetings with world leaders while you handle whatever responsibilities I deem appropriate. It means being introduced as Aziza Valentina's partner rather than expecting me to be introduced as yours. It means understanding that my work shapes millions of lives while yours serves my larger purposes. She stood directly in front of him. It means being man enough to love someone stronger than yourself without feeling diminished. And if I can't handle those conditions, then you'll discover that some lessons are too expensive to learn twice. Her voice carried finality. I won't spend another day making myself smaller so someone else can feel larger. She moved to a marble table where an ornate folder waited. Something you need to understand about the true cost of loving someone like me. The folder revealed documents Magnus recognized with growing dread. Financial statements, legal agreements, contracts, evidence of their previous prenuptial arrangement. Do you remember what you said when my lawyers insisted on this prenup? She traced his old signature. You said it was unnecessary because you would never need my money, that your success was built on merit. Magnus winced. I remember. You signed away any claim to my assets without reading the terms. She pulled out a fresh document. This is what partnership with me actually requires. The new contract was comprehensive beyond belief. Hundreds of pages governing every aspect of their potential relationship. Complete financial separation, Aziza explained. You keep what you earn, but have no claim to anything I own or control. My companies, investments, inheritance, all remain entirely under my authority. Magnus read clause after clause. Any children we might have will be raised according to my preferences. Any homes we share will be owned by me. Social events determined by my schedule. Business decisions affecting our household made by me. And if I refuse these terms, then you leave with my gratitude for the man you've become and my respect for someone honest about his limitations. Her expression softened slightly. There would be no shame in admitting that loving someone like me requires sacrifices you're not prepared to make. Magnus studied the contract, then looked around the conservatory with its carefully controlled paradise. Can I ask you something? The women I cheated with during our marriage, did you have them investigated? Aziza's laugh was soft and terrible. Magnus, I didn't have them investigated. I had them hired. The words rearranged his understanding of everything. What? Did you think it was coincidence that beautiful women suddenly found you irresistible when our marriage had problems? I needed to understand your character. I needed to see how far you would go when tempted by women paid to find you fascinating. Magnus felt his world tilt. Every affair had been orchestrated by the woman he was betraying. The hotel rooms, restaurants, jewelry, all connected to accounts I controlled. I didn't just know about your affairs, Magnus. I designed them. Why? Because I needed to know who you really were when no one was watching. Whether the man I loved was capable of honor when honor became inconvenient. No malice, only cold assessment. You failed that test, comprehensively. The contract's terms now seemed less like overreach and more like reasonable protection. The question now, Aziza continued, is whether you've actually changed or simply learned to perform change when stakes became high enough. She moved to the windows. I'm offering you something few men in history have been offered, the chance to be loved by someone who controls resources that dwarf most nations' GDP, but that love comes with conditions most men's egos couldn't survive. Magnus understood the contract wasn't punishment. It was pragmatism born from experience. If I sign this, I become dependent on your generosity. You become dependent on your own worth, she corrected. The contract protects my assets, but doesn't prevent you from building something valuable. It ensures whatever you build will be yours. There's one more thing. She produced a final document. If you sign this and betray me again, if you cheat, lie, demonstrate you haven't learned what love requires, you don't just lose me. You lose everything. Non-disclosure agreements, non-compete clauses, financial penalties that would consume any wealth he might accumulate. You're asking me to bet everything on the possibility that I've changed. I'm asking you to bet everything on love, the same way I did when I created a false identity so you could love me without feeling threatened. Magnus picked up the pen, understanding his choice was simple. Sign and accept partnership with someone infinitely stronger, or walk away, wondering what loving an empress might have been like. If I sign this, what do we become? We become the people we actually are instead of who we've been pretending to be. Partners instead of adversaries. lovers instead of strangers. Magnus began writing his name, each letter carrying the weight of surrender to something larger and more powerful than anything he had ever chosen. "You wanted to divorce a housewife," Aziza whispered as he completed his signature. "Now you're marrying a queen. Are you prepared for everything that means?" Magnus looked into eyes that now held his entire future. "I'm prepared to learn,"